Minister Puan Yeo, distinguished participants, Datuk, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Before I begin, I need to show you a slide which comes from our legal department. It's from the lawyers, so please read it carefully. But our lawyer friends make a very simple point. The future will always be a fiction until it happens. No one can predict the future. Scenarios are not predictions. What we do is to draw out. There we go. What we do is to draw out the future implications of what we see around us today. Scenarios are firmly rooted in the present, but they recognize that the present changes. And based on how it might change, we will have to determine what we do today to make the future that we want to see happen. We may speculate about the future, but our scenarios are firmly rooted in hard numbers. They're based on the rigorous energy model, mapping supply and demand, that a team of energy modelers inside the Shell Scenarios team have built, which we then link to a climate model developed by a group of climate scientists at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it's these three parameters that we focus on whenever we look at energy transition: supply, demand, and climate implications. So 3 parameters, and we in Shell have 3 strategic ambitions. 1, to be a world-class investment, of course. 2, to thrive through the transition to lower carbon energy, which we believe is inevitable. It will happen. And 3, to sustain a strong societal license to operate, to be a responsible energy company for people and for the environment. Put together, these 3 ambitions provide the foundation to move us to manage that transition to a low-carbon future. Scenarios provide a lens for us to assess our progress, to look at the decisions that we take in order to move towards that desired long-term future. They make our decisions more transparent. They provide a yardstick to measure and to monitor our progress. The Paris Agreement was signed in December 2015 at the UN Climate Change Conference to set the goals of a sustainable energy future. The key target is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial norm, and indeed, if possible, to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So 1.5 is increasingly talked about today as the target we should go for. Secondly, to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible and to get to net zero emissions by the second half of this century. So how is this going to happen? Because, of course, we recognize that emissions are rising. So what Paris says is that emissions have got to peak soon and then to start declining dramatically to the point where by 2070, we get to net zero emissions. What's that mean? It means we are removing as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as we are emitting in 2070. And then we have to go further to keep driving down emissions, increasing carbon dioxide removal, so as we move into a state we call net negative emissions. It's possible to do it, but it won't be easy. We previously had 2 scenarios for our long-term energy future: mountains and oceans. In both of them, they get us to net zero emissions by around 2100, and they limit global warming to somewhere around 2.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial norm. That's pretty good, but it's not good enough. So we need to look beyond mountains and oceans, and that's where we get to sky. Our sky scenario shows that it is technically and economically possible to meet the Paris target. How might that happen? Sky begins, like every scenario, from where we are today. And today is not exactly very promising, but it's a start. But what Sky does is to tighten the screws on what collectively we need to do. Sky requires us to take 7 giant steps to bring in an effective carbon price, to push for strong efficiency gains, to ramp up electrification, to transform the energy system from oil, gas, and coal to renewables, to speed the development of what we call CCS. I'll come to that in a moment. Various technologies that enable us to start taking CO2 out of the air, to end deforestation, move to reforestation, and underpinning all of these steps is a critical 7th step, which is that our mindsets need to change. Which of these 7 steps are most critical for Malaysia? It's hard to say because Sky is premised on an and solution. In other words, you've got to really push on every one of these dimensions as strongly as you can in order to get to where we want to go in meeting Paris. Having said that, let me just highlight a few of the levers that are important, I would say, when thinking about the circumstances in Malaysia. Carbon pricing, for instance, underpins all the other initiatives that Sky sets out. And it's key for Malaysia as for every other country. Without a carbon price, it'll be near impossible to level the playing field. The most significant act that governments can take is to adopt effective carbon pricing mechanisms. In the Sky scenario, they begin modestly, but they will tighten the screw over the decades, ratcheting up the carbon price through their Paris commitments. You might well ask, how do you bring in such a humongous new tax? Well, if you look at the situation in the round, we figure that for many countries, the maximum revenue from carbon pricing will be similar to what governments today get from fuel excise duty. And of course, as we move towards a low-carbon future, we'll be using less and less liquid hydrocarbon fuels. This will be declining, and the tax take will be declining. So basically, you're replacing one tax with another, and a much better tax, I'll argue, because carbon pricing encourages emissions reduction across the whole energy spectrum. By shifting relative prices, by bringing in energy efficiency, carbon pricing brings about an even more significant consequence, which is a major shift in producer and consumer mindsets. Secondly, a major ramp-up in electrification, which will happen most dramatically in all developing countries and also in Malaysia. The historical rate of electrification was 2% per decade since the 1960s. In Sky, electrification will ramp up at more than 3 times this rate. This ramp up has to happen for renewables to come in a big way, and we'll need to integrate renewables, solar and wind, more deeply into the power supply. Third, renewables, of course. In Sky, we move from an era of dominance by hydrocarbon fuels to an era of dominance by renewables. Solar becomes the largest single primary energy source in the 2050s, and our modeling shows that same pattern will be consistent with what we expect for Malaysia. And as you can see, hydrocarbons still remain in the energy mix, but they are displaced to a large degree in the total energy supply by new energy sources, in particular by renewables. For some reason, this is not working that well. Okay, let's go on. Fourth, so long as hydrocarbon fuels remain in the energy mix, we'll need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and the main way to do so in Sky is through CCS, or carbon capture and storage. CO2 is captured where it's emitted and stored underground, and we are already applying CCS at several facilities around the world today. Malaysia should look seriously at this lever. In addition, a natural and obvious way for a country like Malaysia to remove CO2 from the air would be through developing natural carbon sinks through reforestation. That's another area that we might be thinking about in Malaysia. So, will we rise to the challenge? set by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to end poverty and to end climate change. These are the twin goals of Sky. Energy transformation will only happen if people believe in it and if people support it. This changing producer and consumer mindset underpins every element of change in Sky. Shell is committed to this transition to a low-carbon world, and we're moving on a range of fronts. But it doesn't mean we have all the answers, and it doesn't mean we can do it on our own. We need to move together with others in society, in business, and in government. So if you want to have a look at whatever we're doing on the, well, there you go. So I moved very quickly through a number of slides because this clicker, it seems a bit sticky, but anyway, you can read more about Sky and about our scenarios in these publications, and I'll end at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cho.